Lovecraftian horror is an interestingly complex topic for many reasons. For one, its mascot, the tentacly Cthulhu, who is easily recognizable even by those who know nothing of the stories penned by H.P. Lovecraft, is hardly emblematic of the genre. In fact, this genre of horror having a symbol at all is somewhat oxymoronic. After all, one of the genre's two core traits is fear of the incomprehensible. An easily recognizable icon doesn't do that side of the genre any justice. But for another reason, unlike most other subgenres of horror, Lovecraftian horror doesn't seem to have any derivation from easily attributable things found in nature. Take subgenres that revel in gore, psychological elements, maleficent creatures, serial killers, the unknown, or even the simple jump scare. It is very easy to see where these genres of horror grab hold of the audience's mind. The sources of these fears are easy to trace. But Lovecraftian horror, not so simple. In fact, if you're anything like me, you probably don't even really get the horror of Lovecraftian stories. I've never felt any sense of discomfort or fear from this genre, but that doesn't mean I haven't felt the kind of dread it was trying to produce. It just wasn't from anything that went under the banner of Lovecraftian horror. And that is what this dive is about. Where Lovecraftian horror sources itself from. After all, if we didn't have any real reason to fear it outside fictional stories, I don't think anyone would even relate to this fear to begin with. But, to start with, for those that aren't familiar, what even is Lovecraftian horror? Different people will give different answers to this question. Fear of the unknown, fear of otherworldly creatures, and in my case I might even argue for fear of the end. But ultimately, the two core motifs of Lovecraftian horror are fear of the incomprehensible and the notion of cosmic insignificance. Let's look at fear of the incomprehensible first. Incomprehensibility is the characteristic of something that cannot be understood, be comprehended, by something else. It isn't an innate trait, like the color of one's hair or how old they are, but is a trait put on something through the perspective of something else. Usually, that means the thing that is deemed incomprehensible is deemed so due to other traits it possesses. Take the simplistic example of a circle living in a two-dimensional world trying to comprehend the sphere of a three-dimensional world. The circle obviously knows what a circle is, but because it has no concept of depth, a sphere makes no sense to it. It might sort of resemble a circle, but it is so much more than that. To the circle, living in a two-dimensional world, a sphere is incomprehensible. Now, this isn't a problem unless the circle attempts to grasp the sphere within its comprehension. The mental capacity of the circle is still of a lower dimensional existence than that of the sphere. The higher dimensional object simply doesn't fit within its mind. Comprehension cannot be done. Shadows resembling its own reality can be seen within the sphere, but full comprehension cannot be had. And this is where the horror aspect of incomprehensibility comes in. Seriously attempting to comprehend something that is, in its nature, beyond comprehension, so immense that a mere glimpse of it begins to break reality, can cause a sense of dread. This is what Lovecraftian horror strives to do. The second main focus of Lovecraftian horror comes through the feeling of cosmic insignificance. Cosmic insignificance is the notion that we, humanity, are not only not the center of reality and the primary beings of it, but that our existence bears no weight on reality at all. Taking many cues from nihilism, it asserts that we are doomed to a life of meaningless futility, promised to be forgotten and unable to escape that fate, and creates an existential dread in those who face this idea. And while at first it might seem odd to pair cosmic insignificance with the fear of the incomprehensible, it does begin to make sense when you realize that simply trying to grasp something that is incomprehensible can also bring on a feeling of insignificance.
Also, it is worth making a note on the nature of horror in general. That is, not all horror actually strives to create fear, but rather negative feelings in general. One can only feel significant fear from art if they are able to mentally put themselves in the scenario being shown. This does not always happen. Take the horror genre of gore, for example. This genre less strives to create a sense of fear, but rather aims to make the viewer feel intense disgust. Fear can be felt from seeing gore, but often in the way it is displayed, a reaction of disgust is the primary aim. Psychological horror, though? Fear is usually the aim. And while all fear has some sort of source, some reason why we fear it, sometimes the source isn't actually fear at all, but some other negative emotion. This should be noted so that we can separate the two main themes of Lovecraftian horror. Its focus on incomprehensible things tries to draw at feelings of fear, while also pushing the readers towards its cosmic insignificance side, which attempts to create feelings of futility and depression. At least, that is how I understand them. But a single idea can make two people feel completely different ways. This won't play a large role in this discussion, but will help to contextualize the two ideas.
Now, like me, many of you may have read some of Lovecraft's stories and thought to yourself, I really don't get it. And in my opinion, that is because the feelings Lovecraftian horror strives to emulate are not ones that most people come across in their everyday life. After all, generally speaking, art is not a tool used to create new feelings, but to draw forth feelings that already exist within a person. And Lovecraftian horror is no different. However, Lovecraftian horror does differ in that, unlike other forms of horror, it is an intellectual one, and that makes it particularly difficult to emulate. Let's take the video game Terraria as a fun example of art attempting to incorporate Lovecraftian themes. Terraria is an unfair example, as it isn't exactly striving to be Lovecraftian horror, but I also think that's why it makes it a good example when it comes to a simplistic take on the genre. Terraria has many references to Lovecraft's work, whether it be the Moon Lord's tentacly design, some of the status messages, or even the Eye of Cthulhu's very name. But despite these references, Terraria doesn't quite give off the feelings that Lovecraftian horror should. It merely references simple feelings or characters, but doesn't actually call the player to ponder deeply into the unknowable. Fear of the incomprehensible is never a point you would reach within a game like this. And cosmic insignificance? With Terraria being the player-driven sandbox game that it is, where all entities seemingly target the player and all events surround them, it probably isn't the best piece of media to exemplify the traits of cosmic insignificance. The entire game exists only when the player is around. It revolves around the player. But this isn't an issue with only Terraria. All video games will feel these inadequacies. By their nature, incomprehensible things are not something we encounter in our daily lives. They are beyond normalcy and must be confronted intentionally. And this is why having an artistic genre surrounding the idea of incomprehensibility is so odd. While trying to describe in writing something that cannot be mentally grasped is difficult enough, attempting to do so through more complex mediums focused primarily on visuals, such as video games, becomes an even more impossible task. Lovecraftian horror is an intellectual horror. It is one that a person must ponder deeply on to appreciate. Someone cannot come to fear something incomprehensible if they have not come to realize that it is actually incomprehensible. Unless one strives to grasp something too large for their mind, they cannot feel the weight of it. This side of Lovecraftian horror cannot be spoon-fed to a person through art. It can only be alluded to in an attempt to make the consumer approach it on their own. This is partially why this genre is best taken in through writing. Writing is an art that speaks directly to thought. Writing removes the hedonistic pleasures of other forms of art, such as sound and visuals, stripping the message down specifically to ideas. Other forms of art simply have too much else getting in the way. That is not to say it can't get the job done, but that it is a very difficult task. Cosmic insignificance is no different. It is not something you come across in your everyday life, maybe not ever. It's easy to fear the unknown, or death, or other such things because they are very real parts of our life. Cosmic insignificance isn't. We are at the center of our own world, and just like we tend to put things that are incomprehensible out of our mind because, well, they're not to be comprehended, we tend to put things that make us feel insignificant away too. Some might argue that nature here on Earth shows us cosmic insignificance due to it not regarding humanity any differently than any other creature, or point to the universe at large with its unfathomable vastness to confirm it. Yet, with our modern society, humanity doesn't even need to think about the cruel equalizer that is nature in its raw form. We have essentially beaten it. We are already over nature. And the rest of the universe, why should we even regard it? It plays no real role in our everyday life. In fact, the rest of the universe should feel its own insignificance in our wake. After all, how often do we regard it? And at the end of the day, humanity could, hypothetically, conquer the universe too. It is still a tangible thing, regardless of how vast it is. Art cannot capture these feelings effectively because they are not natural ones. They can only point the viewer to consider them on their own. And this is why it was wise for Lovecraft to use deity-esque monsters rather than nature to manifest these ideas in. Unnatural things are best suited for the job, as they already call the reader to engage in thinking about them and thus prepare them to dig deeper into what makes them incomprehensible in the first place. And that brings us to Lovecraft's works themselves. The fictional genre of Lovecraftian horror, or cosmic horror as it is sometimes called, was birthed in its literary form by a man known as H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft wrote many of the earliest stories in the cosmic horror genre, and centered them around an atheistic perspective. Now, this perspective might seem irrelevant, but its significance will become apparent in a moment. First, let me give the reason why I say these stories are written from an atheistic perspective, if it isn't already obvious, despite several of the entities more or less being deemed as gods within the stories. 1. While Lovecraft took much inspiration from various folklore and religious stories, and while his stories are clearly meant to emulate the same deity-esque mythos, he himself was an atheist. 2. Most of the entities from Lovecraft's stories are meant to be portrayed more as massively advanced, indifferent, and incomprehensible beings rather than gods, despite having what would be considered as godlike traits by many. 3. Gods, as they appear in actual religions, are not indifferent to humanity, and often even center reality around their existence. Meanwhile, the entities in Lovecraft's stories, however godlike they may seem, pay almost no mind to humanity as would be expected by religious deities. This is a core aspect behind the cosmic insignificance part of Lovecraftian horror. And 4. The core philosophy of Lovecraftian horror is cosmicism, which urges that there is no divinity to be found in our reality. It is atheistic, or at least agnostic, at its core. How can incomprehensible things be portrayed? Going back to the example of the circle and the sphere, how would the sphere, while passing through the circle's two-dimensional plane of existence, appear? To the circle, it would be as if it were watching a small circle the moment one side of the sphere begins to pass through the circle's field of view, that slowly grows larger until reaching a certain point, whatever the circumference of the sphere is, at which point it begins to grow smaller again until it has finally passed through. To the circle, it simply looks like a series of ever-changing circles, but it can tell something is not normal. The sphere, from the circle's perspective, has no defined area. In Lovecraft's tales, the same strategy is used. The creatures in Lovecraft's stories are meant to produce an overwhelming sense of immenseness, so unfathomable that it can drive those who attempt to grasp their existence to madness, and can cause them to see themselves as completely insignificant. This madness is brought about through various means in Lovecraft's stories, but often comes from a human character seeing a creature that they cannot rationalize within their own dimensional reality. Their mind literally cannot wrap around what they are seeing. Despite the harm they can do in other mediums trying to express Lovecraftian themes, visuals are very important to Lovecraft's written stories. Not because of what they show, but because they cause the viewer to look and think, to strive comprehension and approach the incomprehensible. It is through these moments in Lovecraft's tales that the genre's iconic imagery comes from. However, despite these moments of visual references, the genre cannot be summed up within a symbol, nor should it be. While creatures with tentacles are often seen within Lovecraft stories, the horror does not come from the creature's iconic descriptions, but instead what cannot be described. This isn't a horror of what can be seen and understood, but what cannot. This is why Cthulhu isn't even the best representation of this genre's horror. He actually does have something of a figure, and he isn't actually all that immense when compared to some of the other, much larger entities within Lovecraft's universe, such as Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth. Lovecraft often uses non-Euclidean geometry to show objects beyond human comprehension, but creatures are more than just objects. Their abilities must also follow suit. Let's take the character of Azathoth, for example. What gives him his incomprehensibility is not that he is some large and powerful being out in space somewhere. No, Azathoth is the holder of all reality. He doesn't even exist within our reality. In fact, all that exists might merely be this entity's dream and nothing else. The character of Cthulhu, the mascot of Lovecraftian horror, as immense as he is too nothing more than a part of that dream. Yog-Sothoth falls into the same category within Lovecraft stories. Both Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth reside beyond the confines of our reality, and possess immeasurably immense traits that the human mind cannot grasp. Immortality, eternity, omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, incomprehensibility, and at least for one of the two, aseity. These are mind-boggling traits. When incomprehensibility is possibly the most understandable of the traits, you know you are dealing with something unfathomably beyond understanding. But these are admittedly fictitious creatures. Their incomprehensibility is in name only because they are empty shells, massive balloon animals if you will. There is nothing to comprehend beyond their characteristics telling the reader that they are beyond comprehension, because they are not real. But with that said, we have now nearly reached the point that I have been building to this whole time. What is it that Lovecraft sources his horror from? What is it that has caused me to feel this Lovecraftian dread, even when Lovecraft's tales have failed to do so for me? Why does such a horror exist if it isn't actually found in nature? Why can we experience this horror at all if we have no reason to? From an early age, the young Howard Phillips Lovecraft was introduced to the Bible. In a letter titled A Confession of Unfaith, Lovecraft claims to have been born into that of the average American Protestant environment. He was introduced to Christian teachings as a toddler and sent to Sunday school by the age of 5. He claims it was his love of fairy tales and myths that led him to be a ravenous questioner of the teachings taught in his Sunday school, but that due to his teacher's answers to his questions being inadequate, and his suspicions of Christianity already being substantial, departed only a year later. By the age of 7, he claims to have been a genuine pagan, and at the time of writing the letter insisted that he still was. If Lovecraft's own account is to be trusted, he was a highly intelligent child, reading books, asking questions, and holding opinions that were far above what could be expected at his age. His later writings would suggest that this was in fact the case, but there are topics in the Bible which are far too complex, too Lovecraftian to be taught in a children's Sunday school class. And due to his own account of dismissing the Bible as myths for a faith of somber grayness, it is unlikely that he gave it too much attention afterwards, missing some of the topics which would have most interested him. This is speculation on my part, and could likely be very wrong, but I don't suggest it without a statement from his own account. Throughout this same letter, Lovecraft speaks about other tales of folklore and myths, and his ravenous interest in science, especially the field concerning the infinite space, in glowing ways, claiming that they had major impacts on his life and worldview. He does not speak this way about Christianity. I personally find it unlikely that those paramount aspects of his writing, which define the Lovecraftian horror genre, came from a place which he deemed grey and absurd. Yet, of everything he mentioned being a part of his life growing up, the Bible shows these aspects most clearly. That said, Lovecraft's monsters, whether it was intentional on his end or not, are crafted to allude to the same fear that religious deities produce. Paganism, as I understand it, doesn't offer much in the way of incomprehensible entities. And while it is possible he took some inspiration on these feelings from his pagan interests, I find it far more likely that they came from his enthrallings of the universal expanse. Earlier, I mentioned that nature does an inadequate job of showing incomprehensibility, due to the fact that humans tend to put those types of things out of mind. But what in nature could give these feelings? Perhaps for some, like Lovecraft, pondering the infinitely vast expanse of the universe, or contemplating the ever-existing nature of time would do the trick, but they never have for me. Besides, why would this cause fear anyway? In my opinion, simply trying to grasp something too large for our minds shouldn't cause anything more than a headache, and certainly not fear. Where does this fear come from? And while Lovecraft's monsters could be easily seen as allegorical for the immensity and uncaringness of time and the universe, they are clearly modeled on religious deities and how humans see them within the stories. Lovecraft's monsters might be nothing more than fictitious entities, but they are modeled after gods that large groups of people from all ages claim to be real. While I have heard many theories as to why basically every civilization, of practically any size, has had a religion of some sort, even if only animalism, I find it interesting that, when taken to its logical conclusion, a religion's deity will exemplify many of the traits that are seen as incomprehensible. Primitive religion should not be considered to arise simply due to fear of the unknown, because when taken to their logical conclusion, they produce a fear of the unknowable, which is a very different thing. Fear of the unknown comes from not knowing what lies behind a door. Fear of the unknowable is seeing what lies behind the door and being unable to explain it. Things are ascribed to the unknown to explain it and make it known, while when concerning the unknowable, ascriptions are made as placeholders, stooping to our limited understanding. Perhaps this explains where this fear of the unknowable comes from, deities that we have a reason to fear, their eternal implications, impending finality on our world, and the approaching infinity. When all fear has a source, doesn't that perhaps validate religion? Maybe not, you decide. But the traits which cause this fear of the incomprehensible, the same traits that Lovecraft ascribes to his monsters, can be found best in the deities of Abrahamic religions, those being Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and specifically, Yahweh, the God of the Bible. This is the only place I have ever felt what is known as Lovecraftian horror. Lovecraftian horror is fascinating because while this genre started in fictional stories, the feelings attributed to it can be found in other much earlier non-fictional forms. Lovecraft's stories are written from an atheistic perspective, but are modeled after and preceded by religion itself. The immense traits given to characters such as Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth are more original to, and far more immensely found in, the God of the Christian Bible. So if you enjoy the fear found in Lovecraft's work, or would even like to experience it for the first time, then join me as we examine it in its purest and most terrifying form, a deity in its most logical form, and the only place I have ever personally come to face the fear of the incomprehensible.
As a heads up for those who are only listening, in this next section, many textual references will be displayed on screen.
Gods exist to various degrees and with far varying levels of power within the many religions, current or extinct, found throughout the world. Some religions make claims for a pantheon of gods, some far weaker than others, while others assert that there is only one god. Because of these, many definitions of what a god is exist. However, there is, as far as I can tell, only one that is completely consistent within its own definition of what a god is and how we understand the world to be. That is, the God of the Bible, Yahweh. In studying the Bible, one will come across various traits used to describe God. Of these traits, the single most relevant one to this conversation is his incomprehensibility. The biblical God's incomprehensibility is found both explicitly in several passages of the Bible, and implicitly by examining the relationship of God's various other traits. Explicitly, various passages throughout the books of Job, which is, interestingly enough, considered to be the Bible's oldest book, and Isaiah speak to God's incomprehensibility. But the most relevant to our examination, I think, can be found in the book of Exodus. While Moses is alone on Mount Sinai speaking with God, he requests to see him. While God grants Moses his request, permitting him to see his back as he passes by, he tells Moses that he cannot look upon his face, or else he would die. God stoops to manifest himself before Moses, but not even this manifestation can be fully grasped without causing death. Later, Moses is marked with a shining face due to this glimpse of the Lord's glorious manifestation. This inability to look upon God without having lasting effects is something that is frequently seen in Lovecraft's tales too, where characters will see a creature beyond their comprehension and have lasting psychological damage. With the God of the Bible, however, he is merciful enough to prevent this from happening. Implicitly, however, one can examine the many other traits of the biblical God, such as his aseity, eternity, and trinity, that is, three-in-oneness, traits that make some of the more well-known ones, like omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, seem trivial. These are traits that we as humans cannot wrap our heads around. Sure, we can pass around the idea of Trinitarianism, but can anyone actually understand it? How can we grasp the idea of a God, who so often declares himself as the one, true, and singular, that also repeatedly shows his triune nature? And what of aseity, that is, self-existence? What of eternity, having existed since forever and continuing on forevermore? These are not things our mortal minds can contain, because these are not things that can exist within the reality as we know it. Nothing can exist without the aid of anything else, and nothing can exist without a beginning. Eternity is a trait that, for me, truly brings God into perspective. Nothing about the nature of God is more incomprehensible than his eternity, and by extension, his aseity. This is the trait that brought fear of the incomprehensible into being for me. As a child, I would sometimes try to ponder this concept of God's eternity. This is not something I try to do anymore. I would start with eternity past, reaching and grasping for something tangible to hold on to and comprehend, but to no success and only dread. Moving on to eternity future, I would try the same in some desperate attempt, as if eternity were shorter in one direction, but would inevitably meet the same fate. These attempts always left me terrified. How could something not only exist within themselves, but have always existed? How could God not have a mother, or even his own creator? Everything must have a beginning. The human mind cannot wrap itself around the concept of something always existing even in the slightest, because we ourselves are intrinsically bound to time. Additionally, God will always exist. He will have no end, and on top of that, the human soul will have no end, whether it is in heaven or hell. These thoughts, more than anything else, caused existential dread in me. They were too abstract, too lofty, too impossible to contain in my mind. To anyone who has not thought about these things, and I mean really pondered deeply into them and tried to hold them within their mind, the exercise is enlightening, and I would highly encourage it. This is where the fear of the incomprehensible can be felt. This subject does become a bit more intellectually reasonable when it is framed properly, however, though no more conceptually manageable. The God of the Bible created time. This is shown in the first verse of the Bible. Because of this authoring of time, God resides outside of it. Time is, after all, constrained to the physical world. God has existed forever because time as we understand it had a beginning, one which came after God.
Further discussion could be had on other attributes of God, some of which overlap with several of Lovecraft's characters, though seen in lesser degrees in the latter. Attributes such as the overwhelming might of omnipotence, the ungraspable depth of omniscience, the impossible vastness of omnipresence, or the monolithic firmness of immutability. All of these traits are vastly incomprehensible on their own, but for now we should move on to look at God's relationship with the second core characteristic of Lovecraftian horror.
A large aspect of cosmic horror comes from its urging of insignificance. Humanity is not only miniature when compared to larger and more significant aspects of the universe, but it's not even on their radar. Lovecraft's monsters don't even consider humanity. And this is where the similarities begin to break down. Because while in Lovecraft stories humanity is insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe, from the perspective of the Bible, the universe is insignificant when compared to humanity. Its only purpose is used to show the grandness and might of God. According to the Bible, the universe was created for humanity. The earth is humanity's garden, and every aspect of it was designed to either directly serve and habitate humanity, or to reveal the majesty of God. Just enough of it is revealed to be the grand creation that it is, so as to cause humanity to step back and wonder, to see their own insignificance and to praise God, while also mostly being mundane enough for us to realize that it was designed for us. The world, according to Lovecraft, does not even care about the beings which are so massive that they cause existential horror to humanity. Yet, when seen through the biblical lens, it rather revolves around humanity. This is a fundamental difference between the two perspectives. That is to say, there are passages in the Bible which call humanity to reflect on their minuscule size. Passages such as Isaiah 40 can be found, urging its readers to have a proper perspective. For as this world was created for humanity, it makes them no less small when compared to the immense God who did the creating of it. Another fundamental difference between the two perspectives is that while the beings in Lovecraft stories, who are far beyond human comprehension, hardly even notice humanity, the God of the Bible does. Not only that, but he carefully created them, looks after them, selflessly saves many, and accurately judges all. Despite God's position, he created the universe for humanity and mindfully watches each one within the race. This should cause both an equal and opposite dread. God should be feared not only as Lovecraft's beings are feared for their massive incomprehensibility, but must also be feared for his careful consideration of humanity, unlike those beings. The God of the Bible does care about what we do. We are told that he is omnipresent, and that he watches every action and thought of every living person with the intention of judging them and either bringing them into an eternity of paradise with him, or damning them to a never-ending hell. For those of you who have seen JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, when the antagonist, Cars, is thrown into space, he, in an attempt to save himself from the harshness of the void, accidentally seals himself into a state of being unable to move and unable to die, lost only to his thoughts as he floated through space, hopeless of ever finding relief from his predicament. Were any of you as terrified by that thought as I was? This is what hell will be like. But it isn't the whole story. This is hell from the perspective of cosmic insignificance. While Cars did put himself there is no one to pay him any mind. The biblical hell is to be far worse, an eternity of punishment, of taking on the wrath of God, and never being able to escape from it, and it's all the result of the person's own actions. Immense regret will be felt, and there is absolutely nothing that can be done to undo that horrific state. Eternal and permanent consequence. This is the opposite of cosmic insignificance. It is interesting to see how H.P. Lovecraft came so close to the only other recorded instance that I know of cosmic horror, uncannily so on several occasions, and seemingly never even realized it. He wrote off Christianity at such a young age, only to spend much of his adulthood crafting beings that resemble aspects of God, that only he exemplifies. Perhaps had Lovecraft spent a little more time studying the belief that he labeled as absurd, we would have gotten entirely different stories from him. While Lovecraft obviously didn't write his stories because he believed them to be factually true on a religious level, he was obviously privy to the philosophical ideas he presented in them. Had Lovecraft studied God and his attributes in depth, and not walked away from the topic based on the dissatisfaction with his 6-year-old understanding, he may have found the Bible to be more intellectually satisfying. I personally think Lovecraft would have particularly liked the books of Job and Ecclesiastes. Job comments thoroughly on the immensity of God, while Ecclesiastes contemplates on the vanity of life, two things which Lovecraft continually wrote about. For those who take interest in the ideas found in Lovecraftian horror, I would recommend reading these much earlier penned books. Also, for those interested more in the topic of incomprehensibility from a biblical perspective, I have linked a lecture from Dr. James Dozal in the description below. Additionally, I have linked another lecture by Dr. Dozal on the topic of simplicity, which is not something I talked about here, but dives into incomprehensibility even more deeply.